Welcome to this webinar of the Global Institute of Church Management. I know that many of you are just getting online right now because we just opened up the channel. So welcome as you are signing in to this account with the Global Institute of Church Management with this webinar on transparency, especially financial transparency in the Catholic Church and why we need it now more than ever. I see that the number of our participants is rapidly rising as you are all signing in. And I'll just wait a moment as you're signing in before introducing our panelists. My name is Father Robert Gahl, and I'm a professor of philosophy at the Pontifical University of the Holy Cross, or Santa Croce in Rome. And I'm also the vice chair of the program of church management. The Global Institute of Church Management, which is truly global, although it's based in the United States, contracts with the program of church management in Rome to promote courses of formation and research projects in order to promote the incorporation of the best managerial practices in church institutions around the world. So for our webinar today, we have among our panelists, we have Dr. Charles Zech, who is an emeritus professor of Villanova University and is the founder of the Center for Church Management at Villanova University's School of Business. We're really privileged to have Charles Zech with us today. I was going to say this evening. Here I'm in Rome, but this is our event is around the world, so I realize that people are in different time zones. Some of you, it may be late at night. Some of it is early in the morning. But thank you very much, Dr. Charles Zech, for being with us today. He is an expert in economics and in finance in the church and has also numerous publications and awards regarding his work on financial management in the Catholic Church. Then we have Kerry Robinson, who is on the board and is really a founder on the board of the Leadership Roundtable and has degrees from Georgetown University and from Yale University, and studies also in Dublin at Trinity College. And Kerry has numerous honorary doctorates and other awards and has done so much in her life in service for the Catholic Church, in promoting transparency, in promoting the involvement of the laity in an active participation in the church and in evangelization. And Kerry has also amazing experience with respect to the Catholic Chapel at Yale University, which she helped with the fundraising and the development and the construction of that chapel. We also have with us this evening John Levins, who is his background is amazing. He has lived in at least I suppose 4 continents, depending on how you count. And he's originally from Ireland and has lived in Africa and in Australia and is now resident in Rome. And he works for the United Nations World Food Program, which has recently won a Nobel Prize. And John is promoting financial transparency and best business practices for financial protocols for the World Food Program and other agencies of the United Nations around the world. I might be exaggerating, but I think he said that he's been involved in implementing these best business practices in 190 nations. That I guess that's an exaggeration, not that many, because if you start counting them, it'll be hard to get to 190. But almost as many as there are countries that have diplomatic relations with the Holy See. In any case, his experience is global and highly international, and he is also a committed Catholic and very interested in implementing these kinds of procedures to the Catholic Church. Well, without further ado, and I might make more mistakes if I go on with introducing our speakers, our panelists, let me direct to them, beginning with Dr. Charles Zech, the question to really open the floor, which is, what is transparency and what is financial transparency?
Transparency is the obligation for an organization to publish and make available critical data about the organization. Financial transparency is about the finance and making it available in a way that is meaningful to its stakeholders and accessible to them, and willingness to explain the financial documents as well.
Are there any specific features around the Catholic Church and issues of governance that would in a particular way illuminate those principles that you've just mentioned?
Well, specifically the Catholic Church, like most churches, is subject to embezzlement. We're pretty soft on the way we handle our finances. We don't always put in the controls that we need, and transparency is an important one. Embezzlement is really the sum of an opportunity and a need. Need results from some sort of addiction usually. Opportunity refers to transparency and accountability. We can't control the need of an individual that works for the church. We can control the opportunity by doing things that are more transparent and accountable with respect to the finances. With respect to more current issues, though, when I was being raised in the pre-Vatican Catholic Church, the issue of transparency was one that was never spoken about. It was assumed that it wasn't an issue. We Catholics were told to pray, pay, and obey. Vatican II came along and we talked about collaboration, and collaboration included the need for some transparency at a certain level. Now the discussion is around co-responsibility. The laity are told to be co-responsible with the clergy for the church's finances and other decision-making. To be truly co-responsible, the individual must have some information, must have the available financial information, which calls an even greater need for the church to be transparent at all levels.
Chuck, this is really fascinating. You mentioned that the old paradigm that we are surpassing was pray, pay, and obey. And you also mentioned the risks of embezzlement. You also delineated what the new paradigm is. I wonder if you, Kerry, would like to expound further upon what Chuck just mentioned regarding co-responsibility in the church today.
I draw from my background in Catholic philanthropy and tend to regard this discussion as one of stewardship, of the proper care of what has been entrusted to us. And in one sense, the Catholic Church as an institution, a global institution, is sui generis. It has a divine mission. So it's unlike international corporations in that regard. And yet it is also the case that the church is comprised of people, facilities, finances, property, and these deserve to be cared for with the highest levels of ethics, accountability, trustworthiness. The church should be the gold standard for when it comes to caring for that which has been entrusted to it. So I think this conversation around financial transparency, financial integrity is right on the mark. It is our job as baptized faithful to invite the expertise of lay faithful in consultation and in collaboration with ordained and religious brothers and sisters to strengthen the temporal affairs of the church. And this is important because the church's mission is that much more important than the return to shareholders through a for-profit corporation, for example.
Thank you, Kerry. This is really important what you bring up regarding the supernatural or divine dimension of the Catholic Church, because while the program of church management, we at the Global Institute of Church Management also, we are really committed to promoting the implementation of best business and managerial practices in Catholic institutions. We're at the same time working within a framework that is theological and in agreement with, in perfect accord really with the churching of the teaching of the church, especially the social teaching of the church. So it's so crucial to remember that the church is graced and is the mystical body of Christ. And this return on investment that you mentioned is even more important in the Catholic Church, because the return, I like to say, is leveraged by infinity because of that divine dimension. I'm glad you agree with that. So I mentioned the program of church management and Global Institute of Church Management. You can see the website, which is gicm.org, for more information about the Global Institute of Church Management. And also put down in your calendars our next webinar. It's just a little announcement here. Our next webinar will be on January 14th, and our main speaker will be Cardinal Pell, speaking about the cultural change to be affected in the management of Catholic Church institutions. That webinar, because of its exceptional character, we're going to have it 1 hour earlier. So whatever your time zone is, here in Central European time zone, it'll be at 4 p.m. instead of 5 p.m. So 1 hour earlier than this webinar. Now let's turn to John Levins. And I know that John is very concerned with, and rightly so, in defining carefully the principles so that we can implement them. John, could you speak to us about what is transparency?
Gotcha, Father Bob. Thank you very much indeed. That's the danger of these Zoom meetings, that you actually forget to put your mic on. The 190 countries, Father Bob, is one of my roles as it was the chair of the UN's pension fund. And the 190 countries is close to how many countries we have in the world with which the Holy See has diplomatic relations with, about 185. We pay pensions in 190 of them. But the UN works in all of those countries. And of course, the standards, the processes you were referring to was actually international public sector accounting standards, which addresses really public sector type organizations. And I think both Chuck and Kerry have drawn the distinction between for-profit organizations, which of course have your regular international financial reporting standards, which tend to have the commercial bent to it. But over recent years, over the past, say, 10, 15 years, there's been a realization that your public sector is big and it needs as good accounting, whether it's a government or whether it's a church, as anybody else. In terms of the characteristics, as I see, of transparency, obviously, you've got the sense of transparency of something you can see and you can see through. So it has very much a sense of openness and actually disclosure, of being able to see anything or have ready access to it, which basically needs to be known. Now, it's all very well being able to see something, but if it's information overload, it doesn't help anyone at all. So it needs to be relevant, it needs to be structured, and it needs to be comparable. And this is where we come in with accounting standards, because if you don't have a common set of accounting standards through which the church or any public sector organization can account, and those standards are basically authoritative, you're making it up as you go along. And that is not really the way it should be. Another aspect is for transparency, it needs to be timely. There's absolutely no point in executing a budget if you approve the budget 6 months after the budget period. And there's absolutely no point having a set of financial statements if they're published 18 months after the end of the financial year, because by that time the horse is bolted if there's any issues. So you really, to be transparent, it's a little bit like justice delayed is justice denied. Transparency delayed is basically no transparency at all. The second last aspect I come to is they need to be reliable. It's all very well for a church or a CFO or your parish finance council or your diocese financial council to put together a set of financial statements. You need them audited independently, okay? So, if you can't afford an audit, perhaps a review. But these are some of the things that we could maybe think of, because parishes may not be able to afford an auditor, but perhaps a diocese can. And perhaps parishes can be audited on a rotating basis. These are getting down into details. But if you're going to put out any information, financial information, it's got to be bankable. It's got to be reliable. Someone has got to walk around and see, yes, the bishop has 5 cars, he doesn't have 20, right? And the other one, just my notes here, clarity. This is where you come in with the accounting standards, with being able to present a budget, a set of financials well. It's got to be clear. It's got to be properly summarized. I've always said that if you cannot tell the story on one page, then you don't know the story. Now, the detail to the story, the chapter and verse, you can have drill down, you can have notes, you can have appendices, you can have supporting statements. But basically, This is why a balance sheet is always on one page, because you tell that story on one page. So hopefully I haven't spoken too long and gone into anyone else's time, but these are some of the characteristics that I see as transparency. And then we can go into the imperatives and the reasons for it perhaps later on down the track. Thanks, Father Bob.
Thank you, John. That was really a master class in a nutshell, and you bring up so many important, vital, and foundational concepts that, and you also begin to apply them to specific scenarios, like what you did with regarding audits and the difficulty in order to be able to fund those audits, especially perhaps in developing countries where it may be more difficult to have the resources to not only do the audit, but then, well, in order to pay for the expense of the audit. But you mentioned standards, international standards. You mentioned the timeliness of financial disclosure. Chuck, I wonder if you could comment about these standards and what kind of standards we have in the Catholic Church. And I'd like it also, if you could refer this also within the context of what is the utility, let's say, of transparency for the Catholic Church in financial areas? We've seen the principles that it's something that it is owed to the lay faithful, that they see what the hierarchy is doing and how the church's patrimony is being spent. But what is going to be the upshot? Is there a benefit for all of us if we live according to these standards?
Beyond the obvious benefits of the spiritual side, there's also the economic side. My studies show that when parishioners believe that their parish is transparent financially, they actually contribute 33% more than they would have otherwise. So in the U.S., a typical household contributes $10 a week, more like $13 a week. So that really adds up. So some significant financial benefits of being transparent. Also, it involves more trust for everything that the parish is doing, not just financially, but everything that the parish is doing. When they're financially transparent, they tend to gender more trust among everything else that they're doing as well. Both these are important for a parish to be successful.
Trust in the Catholic Church, it's closely connected with our faith itself, because trust is a virtue that is connected with faith. It is very credibility in this institution that we know is our Lord himself. It is his mystical body. Could you mention how this trust, just in the practical way, can also be a spiritual benefit to church institutions?
Well, a church is a community of individuals, and if we all feed off each other, and the more we trust one another, the more benefit we get from one another, including spiritual benefits of prayer for one another and just the shared belief.
So would you say that the evangelization of the church, her capability for evangelization, will be somehow augmented insofar as there's greater financial transparency?
Well, absolutely. Obviously, a church that lacks trust is not going to be very successful in any event. So the more trust the church can maintain, the greater the church will be in attracting new members as well. Yes.
Very interesting. Thank you, Chuck. And Kerry, if I could ask you to comment about, John mentioned that transparency requires standards, and that there are in the corporate world and in the international philanthropic world that's non-religious, like the United Nations, there are international standards for this transparency. And I know that the Leadership Roundtable promotes standards for financial transparency in church institutions. Could you speak to us about those standards?
Yes, certainly. When Leadership Roundtable was first created, it was really in response to the revelations of sexual abuse beginning in Boston in 2002. That was the catalyst for the formation of Leadership Roundtable. And we were not looking explicitly at sexual abuse, but rather the underlying conditions that existed in the church that may have contributed to that, to those scandals lasting so long. And we focused particularly on introducing a new culture of management that is predicated on the highest levels of contemporary best practice, on accountability, mutual accountability, on transparency. And we never want to begin from scratch. We always look around the horizon to identify examples of best practice or tools that can be immediately relevantly helpful to pastors, to bishops, to provincials, to executive directors of the church's public ministries. And we found that in the state of Maryland, which is a state in the United States, in response to secular scandals in the nonprofit sector, the secular nonprofit sector, a group of concerned citizens had gotten together and done the labor-intensive work of creating 55 standards for excellence that they posited every nonprofit, every charity should not only implement, but adhere to. We entered into a licensing agreement with them. We're able to translate all 55 standards into explicitly Catholic language. We conceived of 3 different codes because there is a different governance structure at the diocesan level, at the parish level, and at the nonprofit level. We vetted all of this through the lens of canon law to make sure that we are faithful to canon law. And this is just one example of a resource that church leaders have at their disposal. It is an easy checklist. And most people, most Catholic entities are complying with most of these standards. What it does is it draws your eye to those areas that you may never have considered a best practice, like conflict of interest statements and policies, whistleblower protections, etc. For each one of these standards, there is a corresponding set of practical resources to implement. But it does get back to the co-responsibility where we started, because this was an effort of ordained religious and lay leaders who cared deeply, deeply about the trustworthiness of the church and the church's both divine and humanitarian mission.
That's very interesting, Kerry. And you mentioned these conflict of interest standards, the need to declare and avoid any conflict of interest, for instance, in competitive bidding for contracts on the part of church institutions. There was just over this past year a development in the law for the Vatican City State regarding such conflict of interest in contracts. Now, Kerry, do you see the need to avoid, let's say, offering contractual agreements for services to family members or people who are otherwise directly connected with oneself? Is this applicable everywhere in the world, would you say, or is this something only specific to the state of Maryland?
Poor Maryland. No, look at the virtue behind the principle. That is, I would argue, universally relevant. But we have to be sensitive in our conviction and knowledge that the Catholic Church is universal, and it exists in many local expressions and in many different cultures, and is influenced by those cultures. What I think these standards for excellence provide is a framework for thinking about how to be the best steward of one's resources that one can possibly be. And I'd like to make the point that most people, most church leaders are not intentionally malfeasant by any stretch of the imagination. But often we can make mistakes just out of ignorance, out of not having the proper, most up-to-date checks and balances in place. So we really are doing a service to all church leaders of integrity by introducing these practices and making it easier for the pastor, the bishop, the provincial who wants to be exemplary in his stewardship.
Right. Thank you, Kerry. John, you mentioned, I think you mentioned this. Yes, you did, regarding transparency and budget development. how it is tells a story, how every budget, every financial disclosure tells a story, that story ought to match the mission of the institution. I've heard experts in accounting who are also within the church, in particular, I'm thinking of a Franciscan brother who seemed to very wisely comment that by looking at a financial statement, he can decipher what are the true goals of an institution of the church. Could you speak about mission conformance and even zeal towards mission and financial disclosure?
Any financial statement should actually reflect what is going on in the organization. So you could have a diocese which is a whole lot of parishes, and its mission to the people, say like in a Western country, where you have education and you have healthcare is provided by the state or by private providers. And there it's the church doesn't really provide much of the social services. But I hope, for example, we have Father Robert Kalakalan, who spent 34 years in Pakistan. Well, the church there actually provides a lot of education, a lot of healthcare, things that the state can't do. And that would really need to be reflected in both the budget and the financial statements of the diocese and the parishes, basically, which are providing that. So every financial statement tells a story. They may not have much money coming in from the local parishioners. I told the story once of the parishioner brings a goat to the priest because that's all they can do, and the priest kills the goat, eats some of the meat, and the rest goes for the vestments. Well, that's something that we can't really fathom in the Western country. But a lot of the money coming into parishes and places like that in the diocese will be from overseas donors. So it's a completely different story to the story that a diocese in Australia, New Zealand, Western Europe, Canada, Australia Canada or the US will be telling. In terms of budgeting, and this is a good one. Your budget needs to be put together by people who have the vision of what the diocese parish unit or whatever you want to call it wants to achieve over the coming year. And they need the ones putting it together need the commitment behind it. And they also need to be the ones approving it would need to be different from the people executing it. Because as God made those little green apples, every person who actually executes their own budget will always meet it. At the other end of the cycle, you've got the financial statements, the actuals. What actually happened? Well, you need people actually comparing your actual to the budget. Otherwise, what's the point of the budget? And if there are variances, those variances need to be explained. Now, everyone knows that in military terms, basically no plan survives the first contact with the enemy. And the moment you start doing things change. Like we'd all have a budget for 2020. Well, look what happened with COVID. We don't have many people in the churches. There's not many people putting money in the plates, but we still have to pay the rent on the pastor's house, and we still need to pay the electricity bill and so on. So things will never go as you seem, but you need to have the plan, the expectations, and you have to have an idea of what you expect to be. And then at the end, you reconcile that to what actually was. So it's a cycle. And then, of course, you pick up the financial statements, the actuals, and that then feeds into your budget for the next year. Well, hopefully next year we won't have COVID and we go back to what we had for the original 2020 budget. But this is the cycle that we need to be looking at. And this is the whole idea of the accountability. Someone needs to be thinking, what do we expect to see? And why don't we see what we expect to see? Over to you, Father Bob.
Well, let me shoot back at you here, John, since you brought up a battle with an analogy. In this back and forth in which things are dynamic throughout the financial year, could you comment on the relationship between transparency, budgeting, and governance? Who makes those decisions on the change in expenditures that are going to be done because suddenly we have COVID and now we have fewer people coming to church and we have new demands, perhaps also new demands for healthcare and for visiting the sick?
Yeah. Each organization would need its own government structure. There might be a standard governance structure that you would have, For example, in the US, I believe, Kerry and Chuck, you have parish financial councils. And I think they were mandated. I think if you mentioned, Chuck, they came from Vatican II, or was it?
They're in the code. They're in the Code of Canon Law. They're required under law.
And
yes.
What we now have is the co-responsibility between. Yes, exactly. So you will have, for example, a Catholic hospital is going to be governed quite differently to a Catholic school. The Vatican Bank, they now have some excellent financial statements, which are top notch. They're, well, maybe not top notch, but they're pretty close to an international bank. And in there, they actually show the governance structure of the Vatican Bank, which is obviously going to be different to the diocese that Kerry might be in, or the hospital that someone might be running. But it needs to be clear, if there's going to be budget variances, who has the authority to say, fine, this budget is not going to work. Even though we don't have the income coming in, we still have to spend the money on these things to keep the parish open and to keep things going. Or we may need to borrow, or we may need to ask for some funding from the bishop or something like that. Each organization has to develop its own governance structure, and it has to abide by principles of good governance. Those principles are pretty much the same as almost anywhere else. You need to balance the different, I call them estates. In most of our countries, we have the legislative, which is our parliament, or in Congress, as you have in the States. We have the executive, which is the cabinet, or in the case of the US, the president, and we have the judiciary. Now, all of these are in a constant state of flux and bouncing off each other, which is a good thing, because that means that one or the other cannot actually supersede can't overrule the other. If you have your president wants to go to war, he can declare war, but he has to go back to his parliament to actually get the finance and the budget for the war. It's only the parliament has the power of budget. These same principles apply in the church.
Now, Chuck, I wondered if you could comment also regarding this issue of governance and financial transparency. And John was mentioning this give and take that we see in the political realm, in the civil political realm between the various branches of government. Is there room for such give and take under canon law, let's say in the parish?
Well, as you mentioned, canon law specifically states that the parish should have a finance council, and it's a diocese as well. But beyond that, in this day of co-responsibility, it's imperative that parishioners, stakeholders in general, have an opportunity to view the preliminary budget of an organization or a church organization. It's not enough to show them the final budget and let them just live with that, but we must give them some input in the preliminary budget so that they have some say as what's happening with the budget as well, some input. Beyond that, the parish finance council, I always tell pastors, should be their best friend. Most priests aren't trained in finances. That's the last thing they want to do. It's important that they have a group of trusted individuals that they rely on to help them with the budget issues. Unfortunately, in too many cases that I know of, the parish finance council is just a rubber stamp organization for the pastor. That's not healthy at all. The pastor really needs to have a reliable parish finance council, and so does the bishop as well, and have a reliable diocesan finance council.
Now, that's very interesting and important considerations, Chuck. We're wrestling with them in the program of church management while really trying to contribute to a cultural change in the universal church by forming really leaders who can give examples, in an exemplary way, and inspire other leaders in their dioceses, so as that the financial councils are not just a rubber stamp, that there really be that give and take and that co-responsibility, that stewardship. I wondered, Chuck,
educating our leaders, we don't want to make them into accountants. We want to make sure that they understand the importance of what they're doing, and they can talk intelligently with their finance council and business manager. Again, we're not asking them to be accountants.
So what we're really doing is training them to be able to ask the right questions, or to be able to rely upon those competent professionals. How would you put it?
Exactly. That's exactly how I would put it. Thank you.
Okay. Let's move ahead to Kerry, and but let me announce that many of you are asking questions from the floor, and we have some really interesting questions that are coming up in the Q&A box. And I'm also, while we're moving through the outline that we had prepared for this discussion, I'm also trying to incorporate some of the considerations from you out there on the floor. I see Jim Pattison from California has asked a very interesting question regarding overcoming clericalism that I hope that is baked into many of these church institutions on the ground. I wonder if Kerry, you would like to respond to that. What can we do to change the culture so that lay people really have more co-responsibility according to that principle that the church teaches?
First, I think we can emphasize baptismal rights and responsibilities, that to be a member of this faith community, we are called to give all of our gifts in service to it. I want to answer the clerical question with another illustration, a concrete example. Again, when Leadership Roundtable was first founded, we were looking primarily at the church in the US and the experience that seminarians and newly ordained priests have. And we observed through data and research, and largely being a student of anything Chuck Zech does or directs us to, we observed that 50 years ago, a young man who discerns a vocation to the priesthood would go through seminary, become ordained, and then may have 25 years of ministry as a priest, living in community with other priests, starting out first as the curate, but it would be 25 years of this experience before he was named pastor. Today, it is 18 months after ordination, and you are not just named pastor, but often given 3 parishes, 2 of which may have schools, all requiring a complex set of skills to lead and oversee this. Well, we went to university, seminary rectors, and we presented this data, and we said, we are deeply concerned that we are unfairly setting these wonderful men up for failure and leaving them in a state of high anxiety as they realize what they have to do to be an effective leader on the temporal affairs side of the church without any preparation, even the basic vocabulary that Chuck was speaking about. It's not that we want our pastors to be CPAs or accountants, but they have to have the basic vocabulary to understand what their responsibilities are vis-a-vis the management of people, facilities, and finances. So the seminary rectors at that time, 15 years ago, said everybody wants their particular project embedded into seminary curriculum. There isn't space or time. Our attitude is we never burn a bridge. We're deeply respectful of the leaders we work with, but we can't just let the problem go unsolved. So the temporary measure that we took was to construct a 6-day retreat for new pastors. And it's very prayerful. It's very much a retreat: morning prayer, evening prayer, mass, confession, fellowship. But the content during the day is our faculty, ordained religious and lay leaders at the top of their field in finance, management, audits, fundraising, how to spend your first 6 months as a new pastor, etc. It's very practical. And it has been described as content rich, but primarily a ministry of hope. I think what this does is that it allows a new pastor permission to name that he doesn't have to be the master of all knowledge, and to, in his humility, for the sake of the mission of the church, invite people who have greater proficiencies in areas where he does not.
That's what you mentioned about young priests, Kerry, who are thrown into this situation that they're not prepared for oftentimes. is really interesting because there was a recent survey. This was, I think it was just focused on the United States, and I know it was published out of the Archdiocese of New York, but it was national, about priests and their, let's say, their job satisfaction and how they were content or not with their vocation. And in fact, the principal complaint there was that while many of them felt a real tremendous satisfaction at the sacramental level, the level of their spiritual ministry, with respect to their preparation for the managerial side of their tasks, they felt anxiety, just as you put it, and a lot of difficulty. And as we've experienced with the program of church management, by giving some tools to young clerics, it can free them up for more of that spiritual side of that ministry, because by knowing what needs to be done, they can then entrust competent lay professionals with those tasks. I wanted to turn to John for a moment, because I'm sure that many of us have had the experience in which we've seen financials published by, let's say, a diocese, potentially even audited financials, and yet one has a sense, perhaps as a non-expert looking at them, that more than disclosure, this is masking what's really going on, that it's actually a deflection from the reality that is underneath those numbers. Could you explain for us, John, how we can secure financials that are really informative and that really allow this participation, this cooperation in church governance on behalf of the lay faithful?
Thanks, Father Bob. Yes, just to speak to the last point, it's a matter of these young priests or young pastors or even young bishops having the knowledge and education to ask the right questions, not to be able to do the books themselves, if you like. Getting back to your question, this comes down to having consistent, and this was the point I think that Michael Ross brought up on the chat, the questions. How do you have consistency across the different financial sources? Do you identify potential conflicts of interest? How do you put in how much you actually pay some people to do jobs? These would normally be, the disclosure requirements would normally not be prescribed, but laid out in principle in proper international public sector accounting standards. And if all the churches and all the institutions and foundations were following those, you'd be able to look at one set of accounts and another set of accounts and see whether they come up to scratch. The other point is clarity. And this goes back a little bit to the information overload aspect, that you sometimes have a parish or a church that does a set of accounts and they do it on Excel and they put the entire Excel sheet on the website. Well, you can't tell anything at all. What it needs to be summarized appropriately, correctly, and you need to avoid the jargon. It's very easy as me as a CPA or an accountant to pick up a set of financial statements and I can understand it. But you might not be able to, simply because you're a man of God and I'm a man of money. And it's not something that you're used to. So when anyone publishes anything in financial statements, they need to be doing so in a manner that is accessible and as understandable. And this is one of the first rules of accountants. They have to actually think that the people reading this might not be accountants, and they are what we call in accounting terms lay people. They could be engineers or chemists or whatever. And they could be very good at what they do. Having said that, I think we need a bit of a shout out for the church, because back in the 1400s, a Franciscan friar by the name of Luca Pacioli, who lived near Siena, is in fact acclaimed as the father of accounting and bookkeeping. And double entry accounting, as we all know, is a basis of modern commerce. Maybe he didn't invent it, but he was one of the first to record it. The church has always had this spirit of accountability, and it actually gave a lot of the methodology to the rest of the world to be able to do it. You couldn't have the joint stock company, you couldn't have banks without double entry accounting. You couldn't have economic growth, right? But in some ways, we've perhaps, fallen behind a little bit in our development of our financial accounting, our reporting and budgeting. We started the whole thing, the church did, but now it needs to catch up with the others.
So Chuck, just following up on those comments from John regarding disclosure, and John mentioned the jargon that can obscure what's really meant. Isn't it also the case that numbers, let's say categories, can be conflated into a single number in order to hide one of the features, or to put it sort of in the shadow of some other expense that would seem to be legitimate? Could you speak to us about how we should look out for that when we're analyzing a church institution to see if they're living up to standards, and also when we're participating with one in order to secure that clarity in the financial disclosure?
Sure. Clearly, it's possible for a diocese or a parish or anyone else to set their standards, the transparency standards, in a way that they mean to confuse people. What they should be looking at is, what do my stakeholders need to know? What would they like to know? What would they ask me if they were here to ask me? That's what they should be offering, in a way that makes sense, that is useful to the stakeholders as well. As you mentioned, I think John mentioned, actually, and not too many categories, but not too few categories either. But what's required of a regular individual to understand what's going on in the church. If the parishioner is able to read the statements and comment to the pastor, and be able to ask questions about why are we doing something, that meets a good standard for transparency. John, did you have a question, a comment?
One of the things I left out, this is why it's so important to have an audit, because a professional auditor will look at things and he'll think, well, we're conflating these two figures, right? No, they should be shown separately, or they should be broken up in a note in the financial statements. So we could have, for example, receivables on the balance sheet, but when you go back to the note, that the footnote they call it in the US, that breaks it up, you see it's actually 10 different items. Then you have the better story there. What I will say is that having accounting standards, having an audit, having good financial statements will not stop errors. If someone wants to hide something and there's collusion and there's ill intent, they will more than often be able to do so. However, this transparency just makes it so much harder for them. Okay, you have to, if you make yourself an institution where it's harder for people to actually commit malfeasance, then there'll be less of it. Chuck, I think at the beginning, you mentioned there's got to be the need, the desire. So someone wants to steal money. Fair enough. A lot of people want to do that. But if you have the internal controls in place that make it so much harder for them to do so, they'll move on to the next one. It's like the row of houses on the street. If you're the only one without an alarm, you're the one who's likely to get broken into. Over.
Regarding that topic, Chuck, could you follow up? And since you mentioned right at the beginning the risks of embezzlement, with which there are surveys and analyses of church institutions around the country in the US, but also around the world, that's showing that it's actually horrifying how much this does occur. To what extent does involving greater transparency and cooperation in governance, not just in financial disclosure, but in governance, secure a real authentic financial disclosure and transparency? Is that also a way of preventing crimes, of whether it's stealing or abuse?
Yes, absolutely. I might mention that my colleague at Villanova, Robert West, and I did a survey of Catholic dioceses in the United States a few years ago. We found that 85% of them had experienced an embezzlement in the last few years. It's a shocking number. It requires then that they go back and consider why that is happening. What is the lacking there? And it's so often transparency and accountability that they're given the opportunity. My friends who work in the private sector are aghast at the lack of internal controls that they see at their local parish. But again, these pastors are not trained in that area. That's where we need a good finance counsel or business manager to ensure the safety of the funds that the Christians are contributing to the church.
I think you, Chuck, and you point straight to the solution, because you have those experts right there in the pews in the parish, and they want to be involved. And I'm sure if they're ready to volunteer to pitch in and making sure that the parish is handling professionally their finances. Kerry, it's interesting, I think, that we're speaking about incorporating best business practices in the Catholic Church. And John mentioned that accounting itself was really invented by a Franciscan friar in the, I think it's the 14th century in Tuscany, really. Now, we use this term mission, with which it comes from business schools. They talk about mission. I know at Harvard Business School they do, and yet the word is actually coming from the Catholic Church, which again, it's as though the church was there first, and yet by learning from civil society, we can better understand ourselves. I'm wondering, I mean, Kerry, in addition to commenting on that in terms of principles and in light of stewardship and co-responsibility, I'm wondering if you could point to a specific church institution, a diocese or religious order or several, whom you see as being gold standards, who are really living these principles in an exemplary way that we can learn from.
Well, that's a great question. It appeals to my basic proclivity, which is to be eternally optimistic and positive. Chuck's research indicating that 85% of dioceses in the US had experienced some form of embezzlement was absolutely shocking to us, and should be shocking to anyone who cares deeply about the church. But it exposed a great need there to participate in a collaborative way to mitigate that risk and to lessen the possibility that this could ever happen again. And but we didn't want to be a scourge on church leadership. It is our job to understand very clearly what the challenges are, what the state of financial integrity is in the Catholic Church, for example, but it is not our job to shame, humiliate, embarrass anyone. So our approach in partnering with church leaders in affecting this positive managerial change included an intentional focus on identifying those examples within the church, whether in a parish, a religious community, a diocese, a national Catholic apostolate, an international Catholic apostolate, identify examples of best practice, of managerial best practice, of financial best practice, and shine a spotlight on it as a way of encouraging others to emulate that. And in a very poignant manner, our first best practice award was bestowed on the Archdiocese of Boston. But we specifically gave this award to Cardinal Sean and his colleagues for their Boston Financial Transparency Project. What Cardinal Sean knew was that everything we're talking about, frankly, that parishioners, the lay faithful, deserved a understandable account of how their investment had been used. He knew post-sex abuse crisis that the financial picture would be very bleak, that it was bad news he was going to be presenting. But he rendered, he formed a team of diverse experts, including, my favorite in this is graphic designers, specifically to respond to John's point that it has to be readable, it has to be understood by the average person in the pews. And so he rendered this report. The news was bad, the financial picture was bleak. But to Chuck's point, the response was, we are being treated as the adults we are. We now understand exactly what the picture is, where the money is coming from, how budgets are set, how our money is being used. And we want to support this because we care about the church, and donations increased. So that is one example. There are many others, but I'm glad that you invited some positive references.
Indeed, and thank you for that reference to Cardinal Sean and his being, in a sense, a turnaround artist. And it gives us encouragement also for the Universal Church, the fact that he continues to sit on the Pope Francis's Council of Cardinals. Now, we've had just lots of really interesting questions in the Q&A, and I know some of them we've been able to respond to orally in the discussion. Some have been responded to in writing by some of our panelists, but we have very little time left. I just want to do a final round among the three speakers, and you could certainly say whatever you would prefer to follow up and to conclude, but I'd also like to challenge you. I mean, if you would like to address this or not. And my challenge is the following. We've spoken of financial transparency and about standards, even international standards. And we've also spoken about the utility, not just how financial disclosure is a principled requirement in the church by law and morally, according to justice, but it's also useful for us. And it will feed into greater evangelization. It helps to define our mission. Is it true, therefore, that if we were to rank church institutions according to standards, even in a public way, that this would be beneficial and helpful because those that would strive for greater conformance to those standards would be rewarded, for instance, by lower insurance policies, lower risk, greater donations? This is just one idea that if the three of you could just comment in conclusion on this or anything you would prefer to conclude. Thank you. John, why don't you go first, John, and then go to Chuck and then Kerry.
Right. I'm really glad you said that, Father Bob, because we perhaps haven't touched on as much as we could the actual practical benefits of transparency. Because Chuck mentioned the 85% of dioceses had actually experienced embezzlement. Well, on top of that, because they don't have proper financial controls, they've probably also experienced even more errors. So you've got a waste of resources, not just, honest mistakes, that like not doing your procurement properly so you get overcharged for things, or myriad things. If you have financial transparency, you engender trust. That's the bottom line. If you have trust, you supercharge your funding, because nobody wants to give money to an institution where they are not convinced it's going to get used properly. I'll give you one of the examples we have from the UN. My own organization has got 19,000 people. We have a budget of about $8 billion, right, in 80 countries. And we are entirely voluntarily funded, which makes us a little bit like the Catholic Church. Whereas you have other UN agencies, they have what's called assessed contributions, peacekeeping. They add up the bill at the end of the year and they send an invoice to each member state. And as you know, they quibble about paying for it. Nobody quibbles about giving money to us because it's accounted for. We go back to them and say, this is how we have spent your money, and this is this is the various ways you spent it. You asked us to spend it this way, and we have spent it that way. And when we had to depart from that, we went back to you and checked first, or we, blah, 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 okay? It's that trust with organizations in the UN like us, like UNICEF, like UNHCR, where we built up the trust with the donors. And that is why the funding has shifted away from a lot of the assessed contribution organizations to the voluntary funded ones, because one of our strategic advantages is that we can account for things in a correct and transparent manner. And what that does, that supercharges your contributions. The Catholic Church is in a very competitive market for those dollars. You'll get a Catholic person or a foundation will say, well, I would like to actually educate children, right? Now, if UNICEF can educate the same number of children for the $1 million that they're going to give, if UNICEF can say educate 1,000 children for $1 million, right? And the Catholic Church says, well, we can only educate 100 for that. Who's going to get the money? Because
I think hopefully it'll be the other way around. Let's hope that the Catholic Church is more efficient. John, please wrap up, and so that Chuck and Kerry can conclude.
Yeah. So yes. So that's really what I'm saying. Transparency is not a luxury; it's an imperative. We are in a competitive market for funds.
Thank you, John. Chuck?
Yeah, thank you, Father Bob. We spent a lot of time today talking about the importance of transparency to prevent embezzlement. But again, I want to go back to the co-responsibility issue, which I think is the key one here. In this day and age, especially among our younger Catholics, if we want them to be contributing members of the church, both their time, talent, and treasure, they insist on co-responsibility. They're not going to be pray, pay, and obey types. They're not even going to be like their parents who are collaboration types. They insist on having some say in what's going on and as much say as possible in the early stages. So again, transparency occurs at two stages, early on and at the end of the process, of the budgetary process. Early on, when we allow the stakeholders to view the preliminary budget. At the end, when we show them the audited results. We need to do both. Take a concerted effort to do both and do them well to make sure that we keep our younger Catholics. We're losing them anyways. We can't afford to lose them based on an issue like this. Thank you.
Thank you, Chuck. And Kerry, just to kind of a possibility here is a lot of people are asking in the questions about change management and cultural change, and I know it's something that's very dear to you. But whatever you prefer to wrap up with and conclude. Thank you, Kerry.
I conclude on a note of profound hopefulness. I admire, Father Bob, your work and that of your colleagues. I've been so privileged to be a partner with you and with Pia in the Global Institute for Church Management. It is obvious how hungry people are for this kind of conversation and for this kind of wisdom. And the fact that Chuck and John exist as Catholics wanting to give what they do best in service to this church is an example of how truly blessed we are when we take co-responsibility and the expertise and role of the laity seriously. So I end with gratitude for this invitation and with a profound sense that together we can all exercise baptismal responsibility to strengthen the church.
Thank you, Kerry. Thanks also for the ongoing partnership with Leadership Roundtable with Program of Church Management. And thanks very much, John Levins and Dr. Charles Zech. Thank you for this wonderful discussion, which I hope is actually creating space for this cultural renewal in the church around the world, because we have so many participants. And let me remind you all that you can sign up. Please sign up to be on the email list to get information about the Global Institute of Church Management, especially for the upcoming webinar next month on January 14th with Cardinal Pell. I think I need to conclude right here. It's today is a feast of Our Lady. It's Feast of Our Lady of Loreto. She's the patroness of aviators, and since we're flying through cyberspace with this webinar, let's pray to Our Lady, who is Mother of the Church, and to Saint Joseph, since that Pope Francis just declared that we're in a year dedicated to Saint Joseph, that he might really protect the church. He who is Patris Corde, with the heart of a father, that he might bless us all. So good evening or good morning, goodbye to all of you, and hope to see you at the next webinar.